And so here we are getting into that transition out of adolescence and into adulthood. And like I had said before, this process can change dramatically depending on culture. But marriage is typically one of those transition points, and that changes as time goes on as well. But we might look at things like, say, being able to support yourself. So living on your own, being independent, financially independent and physically independent, that might be the transition from childhood to adulthood or adolescence to adulthood. But again, we're going to see that a lot of this varies depending on cultures and societies and values. And it can change between individuals as well, not just between cultures. And while I have listed Erikson's stages here, I have an entire diagram and a few slides where we can talk about them all together. So I'm going to skip them here and do that then. So yeah, let's hop right into adulthood, where we can look at what happens as we hit that sort of, we are matured, we are independent, we are now officially adults. What does that mean? So a lot of this is going to focus on changes as we go from sort of the stability and consistency of early adulthood into older age. So things like, say, a gradual decline in things like fluid intelligence. We've mentioned this before in the intelligence chapter, where as we get older, our ability to think quickly tends to decrease. And so we're able to think less creatively. It takes a little bit longer to come up with solutions, and we often don't have creative solutions. But we do see some compensation because other skills may be stable or even increase. So things like crystallized intelligence, that experience as we get older and older and experience and encounter more things, we have more memories to pull on to help us move on into adulthood or move on into problem solving, even without that flexible thinking. We also start to compensate for some detriments or some changes over time. I always use the example of I am a very forgetful person. However, I've learned that maybe I tie it to the next point, technology. I set a lot of alarms. I remind myself where I need to be and when. I leave notes. So I've learned that here's something I struggle with. Here's how I can fix that. And as we get older, we learn what works really well for us. And often when we start seeing declines, we can do things to help fix that. This point here should actually be its own point, but we do see correlations between having less mind wandering and more heightened cognitive abilities. It was framed here as sort of keeping control of your mind leads to cognitive benefits. But in a lot of cases, it might just be that having sort of better cognitive abilities might allow you to focus better. Or it could be a learned skill, something that you get better with time, especially once you figure it out and start compensating for the way that your mind works. You might now have tricks to help you stay focused. So for myself, if I'm doing a very simple task, I love listening to music because it keeps me focused, keeps me from getting bored, keeps my mind from wandering, and allows me to work for much longer than I would have without extra stimulation. Now, while we do say that our fluid intelligence decreases with age and crystallized intelligence increases with age, we should make it clear that not all studies agree on this, and not all studies see as consistent a pattern. And a lot of it comes from how are these things being measured. So this is one study where they actually looked at a cross-sectional data sample versus a longitudinal data sample. And they used the same types of tests, verbal ability, spatial orientation, and inductive reasoning, where the red and green are fluid intelligence indicators and the blue is a crystallized intelligence indicator, where in cross-sectional data, they saw a clear difference between the two for patterns, but their longitudinal data kind of threw that out the window. And so this could be an issue with samples. This could be an issue with generations or cohorts, where different cohorts would have had different experiences. So you always want to kind of look at this and be critical when we're thinking about it. So this is that combination of, hey, remember when we talked about these types of studies and our potential concerns, looking at data from those studies, but also acknowledging that some of the patterns that we're fairly sure occur are not always as clearly supported as we might like. That being said, we do actually see a lot of loss of brain tissue as we get older. So typically by about 90, we end up losing 5 to 10% of our brain mass by weight. And a lot of this loss happens in the frontal and parietal lobes, which with our frontal lobe being so essential for that critical thinking, for impulse control, for things like that, that can definitely be important and could lead to that decline in cognitive ability. One thing to note, though, here is that there are a lot of effects of things like your lifestyle, your nutrition, and even things like your attitude towards aging. But in this case, I guess, but a decade ago, maybe 2 decades ago, they started to have this massive push to look at what was going on within old age homes and why you'd have all of these individuals who were fairly cognitively sound. They were doing really well on their own, but maybe they had to go into a care facility because of injury or something like that. And a lot of people reported that they were noticing really rapid declines after they entered these facilities. And a lot of it comes back to the fact that when they're in their own homes, when they have that freedom and are able to interact with others regularly, it's a very enriching environment. They have lots to do, lots to keep their minds occupied. And as we often see, maintaining that sort of thought process, using those skills, lets you keep them for longer. More of that, if you don't use it, you lose it ideation. And so in homes that had less activities, less stimulation, they saw faster decline. So there were lots of studies that looked at things like, well, what if we get them to play video games? They might not be able to physically move around a lot and go on adventures outside, but let's get them playing video games. Let's get them solving puzzles. And things like that actually end up counteracting a lot of this loss of tissue. And it ends up correcting for a lot of that loss of cognitive functioning. So there are ways to offset this for sure. I actually want to come back to this slide in a minute and look at this one here because we've been talking about that change in information processing, where we do see that our perceptual speed slows down. We also start finding it a little bit harder to make new connections, to form new memories. Spatial recall, if you forget where you've placed that item, and more absent-mindedness tends to come with age. And eventually, overall recall can be a little bit harder, especially in individuals with more of that loss, because a lot of that loss isn't just you're losing entire neurons, but sometimes it's just loss of connections. There are a bunch of studies that have looked at changes in our prospective memory, and this is just our memory to do something in the future. And this is an interesting topic because it is memory in that we have to remember something, but it's a forward acting memory. So not only do we need to remember that there's something we need to do, but we also need in the moment where it's important to have that awareness to recall that that's something that needs to happen at this moment in time. So there are some studies that have shown that our prospective memory decreases with age, but it's actually really hard to determine if that's the case or not, especially if we get back to that idea of compensation, because you find skills and strategies that can completely counteract any declines. So overall, we do see sort of this loss across the board, but it's not always as intense. And like we said, it can be counteracted depending on your environment. So back to this point here, though, I did mention that there was a potential fifth stage from like Piaget's cognitive stage theory. And this is our post-formal operational thinking. So this is our last stage. And what we're getting into here is the fact that not only are we in that sort of abstract reasoning is no problem for us, however, this is a lot of sort of abstract reasoning, but external from the self. So this one focuses a lot on the fact that we can acknowledge that I have certain ideas, certain standards or beliefs or whatever, and that other people can have their own beliefs and standards and things like that. And we could logically reason that both of us might think that our perspective is correct. So we can reason logically about these opposing points of view, and we can accept those contrast. We can accept that, well, I might not agree with that person's way of thinking, but they are entitled to their own perspective. They are entitled to their way of thinking. So we can accept these contradictions. We can accept these irreconcilable differences that we will never come to agree, but we can tolerate each other. We can come to terms with that and move on. So this might be, as you get older, you have certain relatives and you can just tolerate the fact that, they have opinions you don't agree with. But if we both agree not to talk about it, we can tolerate each other's existence into the future. This also ties to things like I can acknowledge that there are certain arguments or certain points that might make another one of those perspectives appealing to others. This could be like if you went into a debate and were asked to argue for or against something, even if you only agree with the for side, you could come up with arguments to make a compelling explanation, argument again. You could make up a good argument as part of your debate to go with something you don't believe in because you're capable of that flexibility in thinking and in reasoning. I have also noticed on the slide, this should not say fourth, it should say fifth, but I just figured I'd point that out here. And then this slide here is about sort of intense decline or intense degradation of our brain matter. So things like dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease actually being sort of the most common and the most sort of impactful form of dementia. But both are going to cause deterioration of brain functioning, usually because of some underlying neural deterioration as well. You can also see things like Parkinson's disease can lead to dementia as well. It all depends about the sort of modality of it. What is it affecting? And of course, what are some of the side effects based on which areas are targeted? With Alzheimer's disease, we end up seeing a lot of problems in our temporal lobes, and the degradation ends up progressing not just from the surface, but deeper into some of those subcortical structures, meaning that it can cause problems with memory. And we have language areas in our temporal lobe and nearby, so that can cause problems. And overall cognitive functioning can absolutely be affected because as the disorder progresses, it moves into our frontal lobes as well, until eventually pretty much every part of the brain can be impacted in one way, shape, or form. But when we look at all of the different types of dementia, we become more susceptible to these as we get older, sometimes because that natural degeneration is just gets extreme in certain cases. With more of those, hey, we talked about this concept earlier type discussions, getting into attachment styles. And I had hinted that our infant attachment styles actually carry forward into older age. And so, two researchers, Hazen and Shaver, in again the 1980s, figured out that, hey, the way that children attach as children seems to be consistent with how they often attach as adults. Now, it isn't guaranteed that your childhood attachment style is for sure going to be your adult attachment style. However, there is a strong correlation between the two. And so, just like before with our securely attached infants, secure or autonomous attachment adults are typically going to be the most common, but also those who have the most sort of adaptive or stable attachments and relationships with others. So they can be independent, they are capable of being happy on their own, but they can also appreciate and enjoy emotional closeness. So they can be with other people or on their own and would be equally confident in those cases. Our anxious or preoccupied adults, those are the ones who come from that insecure, resistant attachment style from infants. And so here, they're typically very uncomfortable with independence. So they tend to over-attach to others in their relationships. They'd be especially anxious because they're worried that the partners in their lives or other people they interact with might leave them, and they don't want to be alone. Our dismissive or avoidant attachment styles, those come from our other, or the last of our childhood attachment styles. And these individuals are really going to try and stay independent, and they're going to avoid relationships as much as they can. They learned in childhood that they can't rely on others, and that's led them as adults to not want to rely on others. We mentioned some of our milestones where marriage might be one of those transition points, but in cultures where it isn't the marker of adulthood, it can also be a component of adulthood. And again, these vary dramatically between different cultures, but they also change over time, where a lot of these have become maybe not as expected, not as sort of ingrained as they would have been in previous generations. So it used to be that you got married, you moved into a house together, you had children, you retired at a certain age, and that was what was anticipated for your lives. And nowadays, some people might choose to have children but not get married, or get married and not have children. They might work for longer or for less time than before was anticipated. They might buy a house or not buy a house. And all of these things change depending on what is normal within that society at that time. It used to be that, if you went outside of that preconceived notion of these are the orders, these are the time periods where this is acceptable, it's now become a lot more widely accepted that different people are going to choose to do these things or not do these things on very different timescales. So those cultural norms absolutely change and evolve as time goes on. And for some of these points, so marriage as a milestone, if it is a good marriage, if it is a happy marriage, so when people indicate that they are satisfied and content with those relationships, they tend to also correlate with good health and long-term well-being, can even lead to longer lives. But again, correlational. But those in unhappy marriages might actually see the opposite. So poor quality marriages lead them to being unhappy, leads to higher rates of divorce, and can also correlate with lower health and well-being indicators. For parenthood, this is something that can also have a pretty dramatic effect on marriage and the status of that marriage, happy or unhappy. And it's often because it's a period of transition and change. It's also a period of really high stress because you went from sort of two individuals on their own and only focusing on each other to having to now keep another individual alive. And it can cause tension within the marriage. But in the long run, as long as they sort of get through that transition period, it can be related to positive emotions. And a lot of individuals indicate that it helps them have meaning in their lives or feel like they've accomplished something in their lives. Retirement is something we're going to talk about again later on because different individuals will have very different perspectives of retirement. So it can be influenced by things like financial resources. So if you have lots of money saved up, going into retirement is not stressful, and it can happen earlier. Whereas if you have reduced resources, it could mean that your quality of life is going to dramatically decrease when you stop working. We can also look at things like whether you choose to retire or are forced to retire. That plays a huge role as well, where choosing to retire tends to frame it as a positive thing, and being forced to retire makes it a lot worse, a lot more negative. We also mentioned that importance of maintaining an active lifestyle after retirement because once you leave the workplace, we tend to see a reduction in the complexity of your environment. You're not forced out of the house every day. You're not interacting with multiple people. You're not necessarily solving problems to the same degree that you would in a workplace. And that loss of stimulation can actually end up leading to that cognitive decline we were talking about a few slides back. There are tons and tons of theories on sort of how we look at things as we get older, especially getting into old age and towards end of life. But this is one of those interesting ones I like to talk about. So this is our socio-emotional selectivity theory. And this is just a really broad theory that focuses on our perception of time and how that changes our priorities over time. So this says that younger individuals would favor information related goals. So I want to learn this thing. I want to experience that. And the idea being that when you're younger, acquiring all of these skills, this information that can help you as you get older, you have more time to make use of those skills. So it's a good investment. Whereas once we get older, we favor a lot more emotion related goals. Things like focusing on our relationships or being comfortable in our own lives, making ourselves happy. So information gathering is a lot less important, especially if you don't have as long to be using it. So I'd rather be happy towards the end of my life than focus on advancing and things like that. This can also tie to the fact that as people get older, they actually end up having smaller and smaller friend groups. And sort of a really dark way to talk about it is, yes, they are probably having people in their friend group die, so there are fewer to interact with, but we actually also see a lot of pruning where they get rid of negative relationships. They avoid people that don't make them happy because why bother making other people happy when I could just focus on my own well-being? So they become more critical of those they give their time to and the events that they spend their time on because it's now a limited resource. This is that diagram I promised we'd talk about, looking at Erikson's stages of development. And Erikson's research is kind of interesting because we set up all of these conflict points. So these are labeled here as developmental milestones, but it's basically a moment where we have two possible outcomes here, trust versus mistrust. And if you reach that milestone, if you find that sort of positive component, you have sort of benefits that come from that. And if you don't, then there are negatives that come from that. And so I'm only going to look at a couple of these because you can read them all on the slide here. But if we look at trust versus mistrust in infancy, children either learn to trust their caretakers and therefore trust relationships moving into the future and trust their environment, or they develop mistrust, where maybe they start relying on themselves. So we can tie this into some of our attachment theory stuff as well. Autonomy versus shame and doubt into that early childhood. So if you have the autonomy side of things, you become sort of confident in your own ability. I feel autonomous. I can make my own decisions. My say matters. Whereas if you get the shame and doubt, then children are reluctant to trust their own decisions. They might feel like they have to rely on others and maybe don't trust their own ability to make those correct decisions, and they would stop trying to do so, and so on and so forth. But the one I wanted to look at here is towards the end, looking at this ego integrity versus despair into that old age, where if you have that integrity, you're getting to the end of your life and you feel like you have lived a successful and full and rewarding life. And if not, you might come to the end of your life and feel like you had missed opportunities or you should have done something different. And that can lead to those feelings of despair and depression and hopelessness, which can make it really hard to sort of accept that your life is close to ending. We did mention retirement as being something important in terms of that sort of later stages of life. But if we wanted to talk about careers overall, there are, of course, theories on that as well, where when it comes to careers, we typically see this basic pattern. We don't have ages or dates or anything established here because there's a lot of variation, but typically you have a growth stage. What is it that you want to do? What do you like? What do you dislike? Can you start thinking about where you see yourself in 5 years, 10 years? That leads to our exploration stage, where you have some ideas about what you might like, things that you might want to pursue. So you can seek out an education, you can get training. This is great for something like co-op. I've mentioned before, I did co-op and tried a bunch of jobs and found what I did like, which was birds, and what I didn't like, which was office work. And so this can be really useful in determining what path is it that you want to take moving forward. Once you've found an area you like, you get into establishment. So find a place to work, get good at it, start making your mark. Once you have sort of inserted yourself into that workplace, once you have your skills, once you're comfortable, you maintain that career. You maybe stop striving to get promoted. You might find a place where you're happy. So you're just in holding pattern. And then as you get older, towards retirement age, we end up in a decline stage. So maybe you stop caring as much. I'm only 5 years from retirement. I don't need to try as hard. My evaluations don't matter as much. Those sorts of things. So your investment in work decreases, probably because you're starting to focus on, going back here, things that make you happy or feel accomplished or good or something like that. We should absolutely acknowledge that people can go from, say, the establishment phase or maintenance phase and decide they want to change. Maybe they go back to the beginning and change their careers, things like that. We also see that women often don't follow this path, especially because of the undue or disproportionate reliance on women to take on, say, family responsibilities or maintaining homes or caretaker roles and things like that. So they might not progress through this pattern, or there might be long pauses as they do things like, say, have children and raise them before returning to the workforce. So there are always exceptions to these stages. Oop, wrong way. Next, brief discussion about midlife crises, because there's always that talk of people hit 40 or 45 and they start to have this crisis of identity where they worry that maybe they've missed out on parts of life, or they start to panic that their lives are half over. And while the media does absolutely portray this sort of extreme version of a midlife crisis where people suddenly quit their jobs or go out and buy really expensive sports cars or start sleeping around because they can. However, when we look at it, happiness and life satisfaction tend to be fairly consistent throughout adulthood. We don't see this massive decline where people start panicking about what their life is and what it means when they hit 40. So a full-blown midlife crisis appears to be a myth. Though there are some studies that see that there's sort of this period of turbulence around 40 to 45 where people become sort of acutely aware of their mortality. And a lot of that ties down to the fact that they're starting to realize that some of their goals, some of their dreams might not be attainable, and they have to come to terms with that. However, it's nowhere near as extreme or as consistent as the midlife crisis myth might have appeared, especially from media portrayals. Retirement is next, and I've already kind of talked about a bunch of this, even though I didn't mean to. But our adjustment to retirement definitely is influenced by a bunch of factors. I talked about the fact that whether it's willing or not, what your financial situation is, can you support yourself or not? Those are really important. Things like, do you have a spouse, and is that spouse retired too? So if not, then you might be spending an awful lot of time alone, which can lead to dissatisfaction and having trouble adjusting to that process. It also depends on your career and how you felt about your career. Some people, their career was their identity. They were whatever their role was, and losing that can mean that they really miss that role. They really miss that certainty. Even something like the routine. Some people might hate leaving that routine. Some people, though, are going to frame it more positively. They look forward to the leisure. They look forward to all the things they couldn't do while they were working. So it's sort of it's either very positive or very negative, just depending on all of these other factors. And of course, as we're getting towards the end here, we can talk about death and dying, where again, we see that individuals can approach end of life in very, very different ways. So some people are okay with it. Some people don't dread the end. They might look back on their lives and be very satisfied. But others might look at it as something scary, something unknown, something they really don't want to think about. So there's all sorts of differences there. And it, of course, can be affected by beliefs and customs. Some people, if they believe in an afterlife, they can be more accepting of the end. And interestingly, when we look at people nearing the end of their lives, those individuals who are older typically have a more positive approach than, say, younger relatives, because they can look at it and say, well, I've lived a really full life. I have this satisfaction, all of these accomplishments that I've achieved. I'm ready. But others in their family or in their friend group might not be ready to see them go. So there's all sorts of different perspectives to consider. And if you're curious why we have this random individual on the slide, this is Jeanne-Louise Calment, who is the sort of oldest or the longest lived individual that they've been able to verify. And she died at the age of 120. So she lived from 1875 to 1997, which is a very long span of time. And you don't need to know anything about her. I just thought it was interesting to include her as that longest verified living individual across her lifespan. And then our last slide here is our 5 stages of dying. And this might be familiar because these 5 stages have been used in a bunch of ways with a bunch of different things. But with death and dying, they were proposed as denial. You can't accept that it's going to happen. You get anger where you're mad that this is happening to you, that reaching that stage of bargaining. Well, I will do this to change so that it doesn't happen. People might go back to religion or something, sort of this promise of, I will live a better life if that doesn't have to happen. And once people come to terms with the fact that there's nothing they can do to change it, they might hit depression. So they're really upset. They can't believe it's still happening, but they know that it is going to happen, and they don't know what to do with themselves because of that. And then eventually they would move on to acceptance of none of the other things happened. It's going to happen, and I guess I have to be okay with that. But yeah, that's where these were originally proposed as Kubler-Ross's stages of dying.